to present at your annual Darwin's birthday. So a little bit about me. I'm a paleobiologist and I'm a systematist, and I work at the Natural History Museum. And from a young age, I've had a deep love of animal diversity, focusing mostly on mollusks. And I got into studying what fossil mollusks can tell us about climate change through actually working with Jeremy Jackson, who some of you will know is Nancy Knowlton's spouse. So, and I was working with him on the Pleistocene extinction in tropical America. But now, following Steve's fabulous talk, fabulous introduction to the North Atlantic igneous province, that's what I'm going to present on here. I'm going to shift to the North Atlantic and focus on faunal change in shelf mollusks across the PETM. I will say a little bit more about organismal evolution, but in a pretty sketchy way. So, okay, moving on. If anyone missed Stephen's talk, a very quick refresher of some of the key geochemical evidence derived from oceanic borehole data that supports the PETM as a major source of CO2 and methane release. And I think I'm straight on. And here's a simple cartoon of today's oceanic effects of anthropogenic CO2 release. And replace the chimneys there and get rid of the ice sheet because there was no polar ice in the PETM. And really, this is pretty much what was happening in the PETM. You've got in the open ocean, you've got acidification, you've got dissolution of deep water carbonates, basically calcareous forams that live in deep water, benthic forams that are unable to make their tests, and there was a 50% turnover in deep forams. Some of the agglutinated forams that make their tests out of little sand grains and pieces of silt, they were unaffected. It was just the calcareous ones, so there's good data there. Carbonate deposition was replaced by disoxic organic rich clays. And in the surface layers of the ocean there, surface waters, there was increased productivity of phytoplankton, and coastal waters, at least in part, were replaced by a thermally stratified sulfide rich soup. So pretty unpleasant environment for most organisms. So over to global cataclysms. When we consider the effect of the PETM on organismal evolution, I think this is a really good place to start. This is the classic iconic diagram of diversity change through the Phanerozoic that Jack Setkowski derived back in 1984, where you're measuring diversity in terms of marine families, vertical axis, and then from the Cambrian to the recent along the horizontal. And you can see basically there was a steep rise in diversity in the Paleozoic, a plateau, a drop at the late Permian, and then pretty much a slow, steady increase punctuated by the KT extinction up to where we are now. And along the top here with the red dotted lines, we have the big 5 mass extinctions that most paleobiologists recognize. And I've added here the Anthropocene with a question mark on the end because there's pretty good evidence that unfortunately we might be entering the 6th. So, but what's missing quite clearly here is, and it should be around here, whoops, it should be around, let's just get a pointer here. It should be around here is the PETM. So effectively, on a global scale, there were no mass extinctions of the same order that we see in the Big 5. So I think Steve's already shown this slide, and it's basically a compilation of data of global and regional effects of the PETM. And for example, if we look at O2 here, basically indicates a drop in seafloor oxygenation, and that's recorded in boreholes basically globally. And we can also see temperatures here, surface seawater temperatures, showing an increase of around 5 to 8 degrees. And again, that's global. And perhaps more local increases in sediment supply, marked SS, which is, they're particularly noticeable up here in the North Atlantic. And so the point here, I think, is that although the change, the PETM, affected the whole globe, it does appear that the greatest change was focused in the North Atlantic, as Stephen so ably demonstrated. So this is a very brief overview of the biotic effects of the PETM. Basically, we can, from mammals, dispersal extinction and radiation of mammals, floras moved northwards by 100 to 1,000 degrees, 1,000 kilometers. As I've said, deep sea forams extinction. There's actually a rapid diversification of benthic forams like this immediately after the PETM. So it's not all doom and gloom. A good marker of the PETM globally is this beast, which is a warm water dinoflagellate cyst, a pectodinian. But even here, the story is a little bit unclear, because this also marks freshening as well as warming. Nanoplankton altered their trophic traits, and diversification of pteropods. And I'm just going to quickly consider mammals and pteropods in the next few slides. So here are the postulated highs or land bridges that allowed migration of mammals, essentially a polar migration at the top there, and migrations from Northwest Europe across to Greenland and the US. So, you know, the mantra of environmental response to global catastrophe is, of course, migrate, adapt, or go extinct. And the mammals do all three. They're a really good example. So here are two postulated mammalian migration routes over these land bridges. Number one here is from Asia to the US or North America, latest Paleocene. And number two, Europe across to North America, in the pretty much coincident with the PETM. Now, mammalian extinctions in Northwest Europe at the PETM amount to 75% of the species. And these are preferentially of small forest-dwelling insectivores and frugivores. And at the same time, there was a migration from the US, from Bighorn Basin and so on, Green River Shales, into Europe of large terrestrial browsers like Coryphodon. And there was a shift coincident upon this of forest structure in Northwest Europe from what we think were rather dense forests to likely more open forests. An interesting tidbit with regards to adaptation is that in North America, in horses, in the horse clade, there was actual dwarfing associated with the PETM, and a 30% decrease in some species at this point, but then they quickly rebounded in size after the PETM. Subsequent to the PETM, subsequent to these migrations, there were major radiations in both Europe and North America, and I've listed them here, horses through to true carnivores and bats. So the story of mammals is particularly contingent upon there being these land bridges as well as climate change. Sorry, this is a bit blurry, but if we consider oceanic plankton, then here's another example of the PETM heralding long-term change. Now, these cuties are pteropods or sea butterflies, and they're entirely planktonic gastropods, and they flap their little divided feet and swim around in the plankton. And they've got transparent, really thin aragonitic shells, and there's a lot of work going on at the present day, a number of research groups looking at the susceptibility of these things as maybe canaries in the coal mine to existing or continuing seafloor sea column acidification. So these images are taken from work I've been involved in, which has focused on the relationships and diversification of pteropods. And here's a phylogram, much of the slide here at the top, of a large phylogenomic data set, which is calibrated by the means of fossils. And it reveals, really for pteropods, this node here, that they likely originated early in the Cretaceous. Our first fossils are known late in the Cretaceous here. But what's interesting is the crown clades here basically diversify coincidentally or basically at the PETM. And soon after the PETM, you have a large number of pteropods found in offshore clays, for example, the London clay. So they become a conspicuous component of offshore sediments in the early Eocene. And here's a diagram of waxing and waning of larger planktonic organisms since the Jurassic through to the recent. So in the Mesozoic, there's a lot of ammonites, but also a rise in planktonic forams. Obviously the ammonites disappear at the KT here. But then in the Paleocene, basically the PETM, there's this big radiation of pteropods through to the present day. And at the present day, pteropods and planktonic forams are major sources of major importance globally in the carbon cycle. So they pull down atmospheric carbon dioxide and deposit carbon in their shells, and then upon their death, it's sequestered in oceanic carbonates. So very important beasts. At the present day, pteropods are they support oceanic food chains, and their predators range from krill up to whales, incredibly important beasts. So that's a little bit on pteropods. So in the oceans, the histories of some major taxa, like pteropods, became reset with the PETM. But what do we know about coastal benthos? Now, fairly complete sections through the PETM of shallow marine sediments are known, for example, in New Zealand, Gulf Coast of the US, Atlantic plain here, Egypt, and I've starred it for a good reason, Northwest Europe. But there are problems. For example, in New Zealand, the deposits are poorly dated and the macrofossils are fragile. In Egypt and in North America, the deposits are rather sporadically fossiliferous. They've got fairly good and complete sequences, but in some places there are basically no fossils actually at the PETM. So what can we learn from these sites presently about actually what happened to benthos at the PETM? Well, in 2002, Speyer and colleagues were decidedly pessimistic. They said, and I'll read this quote, "The response of most marine invertebrates to paleoclimatic and associated environmental changes during the PETM is virtually unknown, as continuous high-resolution data of these groups spanning the PETM are unexplored or possibly not or hardly preserved." And here, for a macropaleontologist, there's a depressing stratigraphic log of the PETM of Egypt, and basically it's completely devoid of calcareous fossils. But in the past decade, things have changed, and work has started in earnest on mollusks. So why mollusks? Well, here are 5 good reasons. Taxonomic uniformitarianism really is a fancy term for inferring that extinct taxa were ecologically similar to living ones. And we can use this for extinct mollusks because ecological traits of living mollusks are phylogenetically conserved at least the family level. So it's rather easy to interpret bivalves, gastropods, scaphopods, and so on in terms of how they lived, what they did. And let's just consider bivalves. Do lots of different things. So across here in capitals, we've got their different sorts of diets, ranging from suspension feeders, deposit feeders, chemosymbiotes, photosymbiotes, and even carnivores. Differences in motility. Some can swim, most can crawl or burrow, some are abyssally attached, and in fact some are cemented, and indeed their relationship to their substrates. So some in soft substrates or living upon soft substrates, others cemented to or attached to or living within hard substrates. So there's a lot of different traits there that we can look at to get a handle when we're looking at the fossil record at actually what sort of environments we're looking at. So in 2018, there was a major study by Linda Ivany and colleagues studying molluscum assemblages that straddled the PETM across the US Gulf Coast plain. And the data set here is actually rather small. It's less than 12,000 specimens over 5 million year time span here, encompassing the PETM, which is this line here. And they concluded that there were few notable lasting impacts on diversity, turnover, functional ecology, body size, or life history of important clades. That's quite interesting. It's an interesting statement. I don't agree with all of that. But the real problem with this study, I think, is exemplified by this figure, which shows they have only 5 pooled samples across the Paleocene-Eocene. Dotted line here is the PETM, and they have no samples within 500,000 years of either side of the PETM, and the PETM itself is unfossiliferous. So although this study is really interesting, it's very little help to us in ascertaining what may occur in today's shallow seas within, say, 5 or so human generations from where we are now. So we have a bit of a paradox here. So in the Gulf coastal plain of the US, I've just shown you the data, there doesn't appear to be a major faunal turnover because actually the PETM lies within the Wilcox group. So it's not a change in faunas is not reflected in different regional stages. Whereas in Northwest Europe, we have the Thanetian and the Epresian stages, which have long been recognized, although they were set up on paleobotanically, they've long been recognized on the basis of marine faunas. And so there is a distinct faunal turnover at the PETM, but until now, this has been poorly quantified, and there's been no real detailed study. So what I want to present today is some ongoing work on the PETM of Northwest Europe. I'll introduce a new data set that I and colleagues are currently working on. So scientists look at the North Sea Basin because it's got the best studied marine, it's perhaps the best studied marine Paleogene basin worldwide, and that's due to obviously the hydrocarbon interest. Offshore, we've got a very complete sedimentary sequence through the Paleocene and into the Eocene, and the PETM is just here. And also onshore, here in southern England, northern France, Belgium, we've also got pretty much the best known and best recorded sequence of onshore sediments, which are highly fossiliferous. And these onshore rocks have been known for about 150 years. They've been described and collected. But what we're missing now is a synthesis of our knowledge of the onshore deposits and the offshore deposits, which have been characterized very well by their microfaunas. So for our new data set, we've examined so far 24 sample sites in the London, Hampshire, and Paris Basin, and 34 sampled horizons. And basically, these are the stratigraphic units we've looked at across the late Paleocene and early Eocene. And these are the criteria we've used to select these units in terms of which particular samples are we using. And we've done that to ensure the comparability of facies and faunas over this time. So the southern North Sea and the Paris Basin especially was a global molluscan biodiversity hotspot in the Eocene. It contains abundant, excellently preserved mollusks, and these have attracted detailed systematic work since actually 1766. So we've got, you know, if you assemble the major monographic works, you can basically fill up a couple of meters of bookshelf with them. And here are some nice illustrations from, I think, about 1860, I think about Darwin's time, and about 1900. And using this great legacy, we can identify the taxa and easily infer their ecology. So specimens are easy to collect and prepare. You just simply dig out big sacks of sand or mud, sieve them, and pull the shells out. And one major issue, I guess, a major challenge is that one needs lots and lots of samples and tens of thousands of specimens to pull out general ecological signal. And that's because of the sheer diversity of mollusks and their wide compositional variance in between samples and among samples. So you do need a lot of them. Luckily, the NHM, Natural History Museum, holds many bulk sample collections made from about the 1970s onwards. And these were often made by amateurs, actually, and they're an incredible resource. So here's our 34 sampled horizons in time, and they actually include PETM sediments here. So we've got good coverage over about 3 million years before the PETM and 3 million years after. At the moment, we're at about 20,000 specimens, but we've got a lot more to still work on. They comprise about 450 species. And for those, we've also got an ecological trait database. But the thing I'm just going to focus on in this talk is actually salinity tolerance. I'm not going to discuss anything more. And I think the reason for that will become very clear. So what I'm now going to do is walk you through time showing the changing paleogeography of the North Sea Basin and its associated neritic mollusk faunas. So what I've done is I've overlain mollusk data on these great base maps by Knox et al. Of the North Sea Basin. And basically a quick guide here, grey is basically land back in the Paleocene. Pale yellow is shallow shelf deposits. Orange represents brackish peralic deposits. Green and darker green are basinal sediments. On the right here, I'm showing a stratigraphic section of the UK strata with simple pie charts here showing the composition of individual samples in terms of salinity of the contained mollusks. So basically whether they're marine in blue, white is brackish, and pink freshwater. And these relate to these strata. And on the map here, basically red arrows represent inferred dominant current directions. And yeah, so off we go. So in the late Paleocene, so this is 2 to 2.5 million years before the PETM at 56.0 million years, we have an open western approaches to the North Sea Basin here, but we also have open northern portal here, and we have shallow marine sands deposited in southern England, northern France, Belgium, with dominantly cooler water mollusks, so northern mollusks, including things like, if you know your mollusks, Astarte and Arctica and Apiraeus and these sorts of things. Now, in the latest Paleocene, and so we've jumped forward in time to about 600,000 to 1.2 million years before the PETM, everything's changed. Basically, the west approaches have opened, and we've got a migration of shallow marine taxa, mollusks from the Atlantic, and you've got sands being deposited in this region with a subtropical and tropical fauna, and generally rather few brackish taxa. So it's a fully marine subtropical fauna which has migrated into the North Sea Basin. So let's move on again. Well, what happens at the PETM? Basically, you end up with land bridges here, Barents High, and the western approaches to the English Channel get cut off, and you end up with a semi-enclosed North Sea, which I'm proposing is sort of impounding a tropical fauna. Okay, through to the PETM itself, again, paleoceanography. As Stephen showed with some incredible visuals, we know that Scotland here was uplifted by at least 1 kilometre during the PETM. And actually the whole of the UK, or what is now the UK, was kind of tilted, and you actually got uplift even in southern England as well, of maybe, I don't know, 100 metres, 50, 100 metres or whatever. And this resulted in uplift and closure of the Channel Seaway here. So you end up with basically this semi-enclosed North Sea. There's increased precipitation in the PETM and the north here. You end up with a lot of runoff, turbiditic sands into deep waters in the North Sea Basin, serve as oil reservoirs, and these huge wedges of sediment over Northwest Europe here of prograding into the basin, very organic rich sediments. And in these sediments, you find a pectidinium, an acme in the abundance of this beast, which is a very good indicator for the PETM. And the PETM is very well represented in this region. If we look at the mollusks, well, they're dominantly brackish throughout this time. They're brackish, there are marine components, sometimes there's intercalations of freshwater taxa. But what we're looking at is a curious mixture, and it's been interpreted in 2 different ways. It's either, it's typically interpreted as a mixture of reworked brackish taxa into a typical marine milieu. So you end up with these weird mixtures. But what I'd like to suggest actually is that we may be looking at a freshened margin of the North Sea with deposits that may not be, faunas that may not be entirely analogous to faunas at the present day. And these curious faunas actually extend into the earliest Eocene in places like Blackheath in southeast London. And this, at this time, when we look out into the North Sea, we know that basically there was a stratified North Sea. You've got a huge amount of nutrients pouring off the land, and you've got repeated diatom and dinoflagellate blooms. So really rather nasty anoxic bottom water, freshening of the surface, and these weird faunas in Northern Europe. If we go into the pretty much as soon as you get into the London clay here, sort of, I don't know, 500,000 years, 1.5 million, 2 million years after the PETM, you end up with fully marine faunas, molluscum faunas, and these are seem to have resulted from multiple phases of immigration of tropical marine taxa, probably through the western approaches here. And so you end up with these nice planktonic horizons and pulses of fantastic marine tropical mollusks. So if we take the, if we do an NMDS plot of an ordination of the assemblage data of their taxa and abundance, one ends up with 3 groups here. And these correspond with axes of, they're arrayed over axes of increasing age here and decreasing salinity. And they actually correspond to, first, the marine Paleocene, this weird mixed fauna, brackish and freshwater PETM, followed by the marine Eocene. So in the North Sea, clearly there is a difference in faunas before and after the PETM, and that may be in contrast to the situation in the Gulf Coast of the US, but more work is needed, I think, and there is a big new data set for the US, which I think needs to be reanalyzed. At the PETM itself, we see these are basically ranged through plots, time going up here, of black as marine taxa. We see that a bunch of marine taxa survive the PETM, this pink orange horizon here. They survive right the way through. And there's an origination of brackish taxa, the green taxa here, at the PETM. And maybe, you know, there was a survival of marine bivalves, perhaps actually in slightly hypersaline environments in the North Sea. Soon after PETM, we have the Harwich Formation. Now, some of these deposits have been collected for 150 years, so it's important to see whether these supposed originations and extinctions are real. And looking at taxonomic monographs and so on, it does appear that this big wedge of originations, and actually followed soon after by extinctions, does appear to be real. And maybe these are recovery taxa, maybe there's something actually more interesting going on here. But no time to talk about that at the moment. So for the North Sea, some conclusions. There were weird brackish marine PETM faunas, and more work on taphonomy and geochemistry and paleoecology is required on these. The North Sea itself may have been a possible refuge for euryhaline mollusks. However, it seems very clear that other refuges must have existed in the North Atlantic. The tropical mollusks of the London clay have to have migrated from somewhere. And so we should be careful not to generalize the dysoxic conditions of the US Western Atlantic seaboard all across the North Atlantic. Otherwise, it's very difficult to see where these beasts actually emerged from and migrated from. I think really to go further with this, we need detailed phylogenetic and biogeographic study of Paleogene mollusks in the North Atlantic, and that data is basically lacking. The benthic mollusk response, as I've shown in the North Sea, was ultimately the result of the tight interaction of climate, tectonics, and oceanography. It's not just a simple warming event. And finally, yeah. So also I've mentioned these faunas are seem to be non-analogous to extant marine faunas, but again, more work's required there. And finally, it seems that, you know, the coastal marine faunal response to the PETM is dependent on starting conditions. So in the North Sea, I'm proposing that a tropical fauna got impounded, and that was a fauna that was pre-adapted to greenhouse conditions, so it's a very hot oceans compared to what we're used to. But the results might have been rather different if maybe it was more temperate fauna in the North Sea then. There may well have been a lot more extinction. And so a take-home message might be that to predict the response of extant shelf marine faunas to global warming, we've got to study them at a regional level rather than making overly wide extrapolations from global data. And so moving on to the Darwin postscript here, this is I didn't really know where else to put it, but I think this is appropriate, as all the living forms of life are the lineal descendants of those which lived long before the Silurian epoch. We may feel certain that the ordinary succession by generation has never once been broken, and that no cataclysm, not even the PETM, has desolated the whole world. Finally, I'd like to thank some colleagues at the Natural History Museum and Jackie Skipper for helping generate this data. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We are slightly behind, well, a bit behind time here, but there is one question in the chat. So if we deal with that and then